It's really one of my favorite topics because there's so much that you can do to use your marketing resources a lot more effectively and to make sure that that really has an impact in terms of our business, whether it's kind of engaging with customers or, of course, uh, selling products and services. So what I want to do is as people are kind of joining and coming in, uh, write in the chat, what is your role and what you want to get out of the session. It can be as detailed or as concise as you would want. But the best thing about these kind of sessions is that it's not only kind of just presenting about the topic, but it's also a conversation. I want to make sure that you all get out of this something that can help you, whether it's with your marketing, with your business, or even when it comes to doing customer experience. So as we go through the first section, uh, please put in the chat kind of your role and what you want to get out of this session. And just to let you know, what we'll go through are a couple of ideas of how we can change our mindset in terms of looking at marketing and what that means in terms of bootstrapping your marketing. I want to make sure that you leave with something that you can use, but of course, I want to make sure that if you need more help with your marketing, that you have the chance to work through it. And I want to be able to show you how we could work through it together if that's something that you would need. But overall, with this hour, it's really to get the most out of how to bootstrap your marketing. So why, I think bootstrapping your marketing can seem really difficult. I think one reason I've seen it's really hard to know where to start and what is impactful. And it's so common, whether we are big companies or small companies, that we probably have content out there and messaging, but we're really not sure what's really resonating, what's really connecting with our audiences. And I think with the amount of like platforms and tools, we kind of feel like we have to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And we're in this era where there's more AI tools, than people. And what should we use in terms of bootstrapping? And to be honest, I think one of the big realities is that you and your teams are generally busy thinking about the business. It's not just, you don't just have your mind on specific aspects of marketing, but you're also thinking of how to make sure something is running well, connecting with customers, and working on your product. Now, some of you might know me or have been here or not. So let me just do a little bit of a rundown just so you know kind of who's chatting with you at the moment. I found Vernonical. It's a global brand consultancy. And over the last, 10 years, I've been able to help, kind of top global brands in B2B and B2C. And that's really been helpful to see really some of the commonalities that you might see across B2B and B2C when it comes to marketing and some of the challenges. Now, I'm really passionate about this topic of marketing because I've kind of been in the whole bridge when it comes to like brand, product, marketing, and creative, where I've really seen what strategies work in terms of execution, what strategies become design, and which ones really don't, and actually start to kind of waste time and money trying to figure that out. Because I've been in the strategy side making pretty PowerPoints and also the executional side of getting those pretty PowerPoints and trying to figure out what will we do when it comes to marketing. And when I say marketing, I mean anything from campaigns and websites to retail and trade shows, anything where you're trying to have a conversation about your product and services, with a potential audience. Now, why should we bootstrap now? Why not wait for a while or do it next year? Kind of before we go into all these low numbery things, it's September. I think it's a good time where we're generally reflecting on what we did really well this year and what we want to improve next year to get to our next company goals. Now, we also might start seeing that we need to start doing this now because we're competing with perhaps well-funded brands And to do that really requires more of a focused strategy that you can't be everywhere all at once with maybe some of your resources, time, and mind space. And, when it comes to most brands in your industry, this is one thing I see and I talk about a lot. And like I'll go back to this a couple times during the presentation is that a lot of brands sound alike in an industry. They're all kind of saying the same thing in slightly different tones of voices. And there's always an opportunity to stand out and to say something that's really on people's minds. And there's an opportunity, especially as a lot of companies have things already out there, is to really kind of clean up the clutter. This can be clutter in terms of ideas, content, design and experience. And this really helps to create more impactful narratives, especially if your company is starting to shift its business model or its product portfolio. And there's also, I think every day we have news in terms of what are the new tools, what is AI doing, how do we use LLMs? And that's something that if we start now, then we can start to understand what really, or hopefully later, but really what really helped in terms of tools for our process to make it more efficient. So just to get started, because I want to, level set on marketing, there's a lot there. So if you could write in the chat, what terms have you heard or do you generally associate with marketing?
Do you want me to write in the chat?
You can, why don't you let me tell me what, Inez, what terms do you associate with marketing?
Terms. That is a good question. But maybe, brand can be associated with marketing, projections, and strategy.
Those are all great terms. I would say it's, brand is really that foundation, and when it comes to projecting, we're really trying to understand what's next for us in our industry, and you have to have strategy in terms of being able to kind of bring that all together and execute against it. Now, you actually touched on brand, and that's where I think when it comes to our mindset around bootstrapping our marketing, I really think that brand is one of the core things that we need to relook at to make bootstrapping. When I say bootstrapping, I mean like using our resources more efficiently, easier. And that's
Mhm.
where another term I want to bring up in terms of bootstrapping our marketing is actually starting with conversational branding. Because today, we're really building brands and marketing through dialogue, like literally through dialogue, whether it's with our teams or with LLMs. And we're also trying to grow through engagement. It's not just static brands anymore. And that's because overall, like dialogue is becoming the driver of brand growth. And this is where customers are shaping our ideas and meanings within the industry, and teams are doing that as well, whether your teams are using tools or really working together to bring these together. And it's because brands are today really built through conversation. And if they're able to do that, you're able to adopt faster, you can connect deeper, and you can really get strong results with with less resources. And I think bootstrapping is a really fun time to really experiment with different ideas and realize you're kind of building as you are learning when it comes to what your business really represents and what your customers need. And that's because so long for marketing, and we've been seeing these shifts already, is that it used to be more about monologues and fixed identities, and words were really kind of felt like decoration. And a lot of marketing was much more about persuading someone to buy something or to use a service. And when we started thinking about campaigns, whether it's a seasonal campaign or a yearly campaign, they always felt like endpoints, and that we had to restart when it came to a new campaign. But today it's more about creating this continuous dialogue as a brand and realizing that, narratives are quickly changing, whether it's the brands or our context. And language is really design material for anyone who's played around with LLMs in terms of creating, whether it's images, UX, UI designs, video, you really realize you have to be able to talk about your brand, what it represents, and your company, because that is design material. And when we look at our customers, it's really about being able to participate first and not just persuade in terms of, buy this product or this service. And unlike campaigns where they kind of feel like they stop and start, it's really about conversations that become these ecosystems and that they are continuously rolling and we're continuously learning from them as a brand and for our marketing platforms. And this is because we're having these conversations with customers, our teams, and I said AI, but I mean any kind of platform in terms of putting in the input. We're just having this continuous dialogue about what we're doing. And that's where it's really important. And this is coming from someone who's, received briefs as a designer or as a creative director and was like, wow, this is going to be a little challenging because if you can't talk about your brand and your services or your products, you're not going to be able to execute efficiently. This is something I've realized throughout my years of being in strategy when it comes to different marketing platforms and then kind of being on the creative or executional side, is that we have to be really clear on what we're about because then you can be creative from that clarity. So what we're going to do today is we're going to run through kind of the three phases of conversational branding that gets us to being more efficient and smart with our resources for marketing. That's going to be exploration, expression, and then engagement. Now, when it comes to the challenge of exploration, I think what I've seen and realized is that exploring different ideas when it comes to marketing can be slow and limited. What I've seen with teams is that many times like traditional ideation sessions really drain time and resources, where ideas are often shaped by kind of our biases or narrow perspectives. And that's not to say like shame on us for that. It's just we're human. We have our experiences that we're really uh, kind of building off of. And it can be hard to really test multiple directions quickly, whether it's a campaign or doing, certain changes when it comes to retail or websites. And what I've seen with with myself and even when it comes to my clients is that teams, as I said, are busy. They're really thinking about so many aspects of the business. And without that mind space, it's really easy to get stuck in the same kind of creative loops over and over when it comes to trying to express what our brands, products, and services are about to better talk to our audiences and to better engage them. Now, I really believe that when it comes to exploration, it's about creating these feedback loops that really become this creative engine. And the reason I put this image up here was when I was in Amsterdam, I used to do stand-up comedy, and it wasn't amazing, but I did it for the writing aspect because in stand-up, you have to speak to or reference like a universal truth that no one's talking about. It's something that you've thought about but never mentioned, or it's something you're thinking then. And that's what makes it funny. It has to be super immediate. And that's something that you're really looking for when it comes to creating an idea that can become a marketing campaign. It can become the core of your brand narrative on your website. It's it's really finding that universal truth to talk to. And what I find, and much like stand-up comedy, is the best ideas are refined through dialogue. There's so many stories of comedians who go up on stage and have a book and kind of cross off jokes if they didn't land. It's kind of like Twitter X, but in real time, because that's how you can refine narratives. But today we get to have opportunities to refine these narratives in different ways. We can use AI or LLMs to mine for content to help us develop narratives and hopefully kind of correct from some of those blind spots that we might have in terms of our campaigns. And we can now rapidly prototype dozens of options in hours and not weeks, making it a lot faster to develop our campaigns, to develop our marketing approaches and strategy. And it's really, you know, there's no substitution for human creativity, but there's really that acceleration when it comes to using tools to help us find different and fresh angles to how we start to talk about our products and services. And this is something that I've always helped my clients see. And the results that they had, they've generally said to me like, wow, I never, thought about it this way in terms of our business. And I can really start to see the potential of our products and how someone might view this as valuable within their business. I think when we get kind of caught up in the business, it's hard to think outside of it as someone might be seeing us. Now, when it comes to expression, I think one of the key challenges is how do we turn ideas into a consistent brand voice? And what happens is that brand identity often gets diluted across channels. What I've realized and seen is that many times we're building these things over time, and brand identity starts to shift over time, which is completely normal and natural when it comes to building a brand that is really starting to communicate key ideas within our marketing strategy. And what starts to happen, especially if you have multiple people or tools executing against it, is that the tone can feel inconsistent or inauthentic to audiences, and it can be a little frustrating because traditionally messaging can take months to finalize, and within that finalization, context can change in terms of our industries, and I'll come back to this a couple times, but what I've realized is that there's also this risk of defaulting to kind of what I would say like generic, safe industry talk. And when we do that, then we can't stand out or engage. And much like going back to stand-up comedy, we're not addressing that universal truth that everyone is thinking, but no one is saying. And that's one of the real opportunities when it comes to standing out with your marketing messaging, because you're almost thinking the thoughts that your audience, your potential customers are. Now, I think to do this, it's really about conversational expression where you have adaptive brands as your base. I wanted to put this image up there. When I was working agency side for doing retail, this was for Clinique, and it was really important for us to address the kind of industry and cultural truth around beauty. This was a store in China. And what were the different um, kind of key aspects of beauty, within China? What were the cultural implications? What were the identity implications? And because we knew that, we were able to speak to it, to create something new and fresh that not only worked, with the brand, but also really worked, with that context. And what I found is that we can really use conversation to still, story, tone, and messaging to be able to have those connections. Because when it comes to marketing, we are setting up the conversations that our customers and audiences are going to have, with, potentially sales, or really setting their expectations when it comes to customer experience. It's almost like the host at the party when it comes to all of that type of dialogue and those conversations. And now we have the opportunity to kind of pressure test this a little faster when it comes to, personas along the way. And there is, as I said, no substitution for human creativity, and there's no substitution for being able to talk to someone directly in terms of, does something make sense? How does this resonate? But we can start to iterate faster and get to, either new directions or more refined directions by using kind of synthetic personas. And we have the opportunity, and that's something that um, I was able to help this client with, was really challenging what was that typical industry talk to get attention. Uh, when it comes to beauty within China, there's just so much more impact in terms of your life and your status. And we want to make sure that we came to the table with something different that you could enjoy and be happy when it comes to, dealing with your skin and taking care of yourself. And that was the different conversation that we wanted to bring in terms of, in terms of that industry talk. And what clients start to see with that is that they can have different conversations that are much like with this idea of conversational branding, that are meaningful for their audiences, and you have more kind of an increased sense of engagement. And the biggest thing I would say, especially as someone who's been on the side of like doing strategy and executing creatively, is that we have to really focus on clarity and resonance over perfection. And this is because we're in an age where there's just so much going on. There's so many conversations. If we're a little too clever or a little too abstract, it's really hard for our audiences to understand that. And this is coming from me, someone who's made my share of abstract concepts and realized along the way it didn't lead to good work in terms of being able to create whether it's visuals for a campaign, an overall campaign idea that was modular, or how that started to really translate into websites or say experiences before someone would, engage in whether it's, a portfolio of products or a portfolio of digital services. And I I'm really kind of passionate about that in terms of bootstrapping marketing because it's not fancy. It's really about getting things right and clear so that when you start to execute, it's so much easier to do. It's easier to create that kind of those modular aspects that can expand way beyond, that one project that you might be doing. And I'm wondering with you all, I know some uh, you know, we have different people across the board, whether it's design, customer experience. I'm just wondering, when was the last time you audited your marketing or even thought about what kind of tools and assets that you use in terms of marketing?
Well, in my case, I have actually never thought about it in specific. So I came across how to marketing like in terms of design, like Canva through Instagram or LinkedIn, but other than that, not much.
That's fair enough. It's it's as I mentioned, one of those things that takes quite a bit of mind space to do in terms of being able to, think about your marketing and approach if it's relevant, when it comes to your work. And I find that with, kind of the clients I've worked with, that if they're able to start to kind of think through what tools they're using, their approach and their, the strategy, what are the assets that they're creating, it can really help them be clear in terms of what their next steps are. And that's the same thing in even design when you start to kind of audit, whether you look at a website in terms of its approach, how did you build it? What were the assets that you're using to build it? And that's where that modularity really comes in. And what I always encourage people is that every situation is different, and there's just so many things out there when it comes to bootstrapping your marketing. And if you have, I would really encourage you to, ask as many questions on this presentation. But if you have even more questions that you want to get out of it, please, book a call for next week. This is something I love talking about because, as we were kind of talking about it, and there's a lot around it. It can be a little confusing, and there are so many steps to making it more efficient. So that's what I always encourage because it's not just about tools. And I think now the conversation is so much about like AI, but it's really about getting clear in terms of what is our positioning and messaging. Because without that, I can promise you, whether you're creating, websites, retail experience, um, doing photography, creating digital assets, that uh, it will not work and it will not execute. And that's where your positioning and messaging is super key and being really super clear. And that's usually the second step. It's not, as I said, it's not fancy, but it's really that foundation that will allow you to kind of bootstrap your marketing to make it effective in terms of having sales conversations or setting up expectations. Let's jump back into it. In terms of the last thing, uh, in terms of that last challenge of, marketing is still kind of seen as a one-way broadcast. I think there are some brands that are good at making a conversation or see that value, but I think it could even be a little bit better, especially within certain industries that perhaps we're not as comfortable with this idea. And what I've seen is that campaigns really start to push messages instead of sparking dialogue. And kind of going back to that messaging aspect, what I've realized is because we just didn't have the time to think from the outside in terms of how our kind of customers and audiences talking about the industry versus how are we thinking about it as we're building things for the business. And what also starts happening within marketing is that we actually have a lot of data and a lot of feedback, but it can go unheard or it can come too late in terms of improving a campaign or a website or a retail experience. And engagement can feel a little transactional and not relational. And this can be quite an issue when it comes to um, many things, but especially with like larger purchases where there's more at stake in terms of buying something. And that can be something personal, and that can of course be for a business. And what I've also realized is that brands really struggle to adapt once a campaign is live. And without that kind of feedback loop, you're not able to kind of capitalize on the fact that you actually are now talking with someone in terms of your services and your products and what you can offer them. And I put this example up here. It's a little bit kind of difficult to see, but I was working with Yolele. They are a CPG or FMCG brand, within consumer products. And I was working with them to go into B2B for ingredients. They work mainly with Fonio. And we were trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to optimize or work on your marketing right now? What to do? I think a lot of people look at like what is the biggest, scariest thing, what's taking all of our resources, but the thing that's right in front of you can be so valuable in terms of scaling ideas with marketing. I think a lot of people think you have to make this huge, complex system from the beginning, and you don't. You need to start with one thing, and that thing would usually expand out into different aspects. Actually, going back to that Clinique example, that was if you've been into a shop and shop recently, you might have seen that design because we are able to take something, that kind of universal conversation, to help drive how we did that interpretation of the brand within retail, and it became their overall global strategy. So within, bootstrapping your marketing, it's also trying to gain momentum by doing projects really well, no matter how big or how small, because generally there are aspects of those that can be taken and used elsewhere, whether it's like you do a campaign and some of the imagery can be used on websites and it starts to drive that, or you're making a website and it really drives how you're starting to talk about things in sales assets. So I would say that a lot of some things can scale from something quite small. So back to this example, just so I kind of bring it back to Yolele, was we realized that they had trade shows coming up, like really important trade shows within the industry and B2B, kind of food service coming up in like a month. And this was the first time they were actually going to show themselves as a kind of a B2B brand and not just a B2C brand. And I said, well, that is the thing that we need to work toward, is how do we create your messaging matrix, get really clear on how you talk about your brand and your product to different people, because you're going to have different stakeholders. You might talk to procurement and marketing and R&D and maybe the CEO about your products, and you're going to want to have a conversation that's relevant to them. The conversation you'll have with R&D about an ingredient is going to be a little different than what you're going to have with marketing. So how do we start making it super clear so you have those talking points and you can learn in real time? You can come back and say, okay, well, from this matrix we made, this worked and this didn't. And of course, we can do that with, you know, in the digital world or in, certain campaigns, but it's really about looking at those opportunities, whatever they are, in real life, online, to launch those interactive experiences with customers and to really identify them, because it's not just about, as I mentioned, the monologue, but making sure that you can have those dialogues and that it's not just about like that transaction, but kind of learning throughout your campaigns and throughout your marketing so that it's a continuous conversation. And that's why when they said to me, like, we have trade shows coming up, I was like, that is exactly what we need to work toward because they are fantastic. Like, you can have conversations with people. People are sometimes a little bored, everyone's a little chatty. You get to talk to customers, industry experts. That is where we're going to kind of do tests and learn. And we look at digital a lot, but we can test and learn in real time in the physical world too. And the one thing that I think we sometimes forget is when speaking about conversations and marketing is that we might worry that, oh my gosh, we just don't have the data if it's a smaller company, but anyone who's worked in sales can tell you so many things about the conversations they have with customers, how people push back, what people like. We really have, whether it's structured or unstructured data, kind of everywhere that we can start with to at least, go into a different direction to really kind of clean up our clutter when it comes to how we're talking about, kind of our brands overall. And I can't emphasize enough, and this is what I've learned with my clients, is that you'll get results from, of course, from big projects doing big things, but you can get really big results over time with starting with a really focused project that can expand its learnings across, different platforms, assets, and projects. Because if you have the opportunity, like a trade show, or you have the opportunity of a certain campaign because of the time of year, take that and start with it because something small can really become something bigger for your business. And that is such a easy way to kind of bootstrap is sure we have to address the bigger things, but find the smaller things that are now and to really improve them because you'll be surprised with where you can go with that. Focused projects are always better than some of those kind of behemoth projects that we can have in marketing or that feeling like we've addressed that it's just everything. We have to be everything and everywhere all at once. Now, when it comes to this idea of kind of conversational branding, that kind of foundation with bootstrapping your marketing, the three phases we have are exploration, expression, and engagement. And, I realize it's really complicated. There's a lot in marketing, but the core thing is, and I can't express this enough, especially as someone who's been on the design side, getting those briefs, is that the clearer, the better. The more you can speak about your brand clearly, the better you're going to have with execution. If you don't, it doesn't matter if you're using LLMs to create images or you're going out there and doing photo shoots. If you really can't talk about your brand and your product and your service, then you won't really know what is that perspective that you need to take, with your different design assets or campaign assets. And that's actually, I'm working on a campaign right now, and I received a brand narrative. And I was like, I can tell you if we gave this to anyone, whether it's like an agency or we use an AI tool, they wouldn't really know what to do with it. And you're going to find that you're going to have kind of like round after round of execution, whether it's a tool or a team, because they're going to be trying to figure it out and trying to find that kind of universal truth that they need to build off of to create a conversation that is interesting. And again, conversations happen in marketing over so many different assets, whether it's going through a website, whether it's retail, whether it's kind of the example in B2B trade shows, which are so important, even though they can be really overwhelming for anyone who just finds it to be a lot in 3 days. To product landing pages. It's all being us trying to be able to speak about our products. And that's why conversational branding really has a different structure than we might have thought when it comes to branding. It's about looking at those evolving narratives. Like, how do we ensure that we can listen, learn, and adapt to dialogue? And I think a lot of brands feel like they need to have this really big vision, and when they do marketing, they need to speak to this really large vision. But it's actually, I would say, it's more about what is that conversation that you want to be a part of when it comes to culture or society. It doesn't need to be super complex. It can be a lot more grounded. But what is that conversation that you want to drive, and when you have that voice in your marketing, it's not just tone of voice, because as I mentioned, you can have a different tone of voice with the same industry conversation, and then it's just not that interesting just because it's in a different tone of voice. But what is your voice when it comes to marketing? Are you a listener? Are you trying to be a challenger, a guide, or a storyteller? When it comes to, how you're speaking. So when we were looking at Yolele, it really was being a guide in terms of how can you can innovate with integrity, because Fonio has so many aspects uh, that contribute to UN sustainability goals, just as an example. And in terms of this idea of exchange and being able to continuously learn, it's not just about transaction, but how do we learn about how we have the right conversations is what do we want to give people, whether it's like value, meaning, or experience. And when I mean experience, it's much like you might engage with a company to sell your apartment or sell your home, and they might give you the experience of being able to evaluate it very quickly, which actually these tools are a lot easier to build now. And what do we want to receive in terms of that, whether it's reports, ideas, webinars, and what is that exchange? And again, it's not being transactional, but we're, kind of exchanging, thoughts for thoughts, or you know, being able to have the conversation over time. And how can we be partners in dialogue? And what are our partners in dialogue in terms of creating marketing? Who do we invite in the conversation? Is it customers, communities, employees? And I have to say, is it kind of LLMs? Who are our partners in that dialogue in terms of conversational branding? And as I mentioned, like it's kind of a lot in marketing, I find, as someone who's come into it after being in other things, I find it to be a little overwhelming and sometimes convoluted, especially when it comes to just being able to talk about what you do and having a conversation. So if there's something that's been on your mind about marketing, you want to learn more, that's kind of beyond an hour, which always goes really quickly, book a call. I love speaking about this and talking about it and kind of learning what's on people's minds. That's one reason I do webinars, is to just understand what are the questions people have around kind of marketing and how to make it more efficient. And as I mentioned, you can have all the fancy tools in the world or all the fancy agencies, but if you really are not sharp on what your positioning is and your messaging, it's going to take you many rounds to figure out how to express something. And our positioning within a company shifts over time, and where we want to be now might be different than later. And that's where kind of doing an audit really helps. It's not something super complex, but it's generally trying to sharpen what's already there and what we've learned. I was actually speaking to a business owner who helps sell businesses, and he's learned that what he thought who he thought his customer was is changing. What his services are changing, and that's where your positioning keeps adjusting as you're learning and as you're having those conversations. And then it's really looking at how do we optimize certain parts of our marketing? And that sounds really scary and even vague, optimization, but it's, what's that thing now that we can work on, make it better, and then we can start to use aspects of that in other parts of the market, in other parts of your marketing. Maybe there's certain messaging that works, imagery, to really start to scale it. But starting with something that you need to address now and is really important, whether it's a campaign, or actually that example that I gave was kind of redesigning a website, where I said redesigning a website isn't hard, but we have to make sure that the positioning and the messaging and that narrative makes sense, and that experience that you're providing to engage someone also makes sense in terms of the overall conversation. So as I mentioned, conversational branding is that foundation for bootstrapping your marketing. It's actually not super sexy and it's not super crazy. It's really about being clear, and realizing if we can't speak about our brand, our product and service, we can't execute efficiently, whatever that means. And I just want to leave you with a couple thoughts, and then we can kind of jump into any questions, or even thoughts. Maybe you've seen something recently and are kind of wondering what does that mean in terms of marketing, but it's really about being able to adapt in real time to stay relevant. And it's not just because the world is changing really quickly, it's because the conversations we're having around certain things are always changing and industries are always adjusting in terms of what's going on. And it's not just about funnels, but feedback loops. We've become very enamored by a funnel, but it's more about how do we start to make sure everything that we do is we're using it to learn and to better engage with our audience in whichever platform we use. And as I mentioned, it feels like we have to be everywhere all at once, and that we really don't. And it depends on the scale of the business and the team and kind of the expertise, but you can be as on as many or as little platforms as you need. But it's really actually more important to be on the platforms that are relevant to your customers and your audience. So I realize it's kind of a lot. It's one of those topics where we could jump into so many specifics around it, whether it's like how to do messaging better, what kind of tools, how to structure, what to start with. So that's why I want to open it up to you all and see like, do you have any questions? Whether it's things I mentioned or even just aspects of bootstrapping your marketing that you might have come across. Because I would just love that you're able to get something that you can use in your work or kind of think about, for future projects. So I'll open up and see if what's on people's minds.
Well, I like to congratulate you because the all the presentation is very well structured and although it is simple, it is very like into the point. So I really appreciated it. And in my case, it helped me, well, see things well more clearly.
Hmm.
So some months ago, I did build a website, and it was well, at first I had a lot of ideas.
Yeah.
uh, but then it was difficult to have everything built in a clean and nice way. So I had to, well, put it very simple so I could go straight to the point that I wanted to. That was something like, okay, I can present myself what I do, and I don't need much more because uh, the more after I can explain it later. Um, and it was a little bit like that, and well, listening to you made me well rethink that sometimes it might be easier or not better to have like bullet points or something more concise than having a resume or something that might confuse or
Hmm.
go to well distress someone basically.
Yeah, I see your point in terms of kind of content is like how much do we say and how do we structure it? And what, something I've kind of realized writing content is that we read differently these days. Actually, there was an interesting podcast that was talking comparing the most popular novel 10 years ago versus today and the amount of words that had in the first sentence. And it's a really kind of strange example, but they said, okay, that book 100 years ago, the first sentence had 146 words. I remember that because that was ridiculous. And then today, the first sentence had like 26 words. And that conciseness and kind of clarity has become more important, especially as we're reading and consuming content differently. So indeed, actually, sometimes less is, well, I'm going to say less is more, but less can be clearer. And much like you mentioned with a website, it's not just content that's speaking, but it's also the aspects of design, whether we're using imagery, a certain type of kind of atmosphere for what we've chosen from kind of colors and textures and iconography, and all of those things are speaking to people. So we're also, through websites or even campaigns, we have visual aspects that talk. Um, and it was actually kind of a point I made with a client recently because we were doing like digital assets and they wanted to put lots of words on something that much like a kind of a website you see for like a couple seconds, like the classic website test is like show it for 3 seconds, what do you get out of it? Um, and I mentioned I was like, you have imagery as well that is also speaking to someone. And I think we sometimes forget about that, that we think content has to carry all the weight when content's just one part. So indeed, clarity helps. And even with websites, like to be honest, I think some companies can just start with like a one pager to really get that conversation started. And if someone's interested, they'll contact. So I think we feel like we have to do more sometimes when we can kind of start with the MVP in a way and then kind of move on and start expanding that website when we need to. So you've you've definitely hit on something that I find really important, which is how do we structure content? How much do we need at certain stages of our business?
Yeah, exactly.
No, so I
Exactly.
I I find it, yeah, that example is really random, but about the novel, but I was like, wow, that's way different than how we read now. Um any
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Here in Portugal, we well, this the same thing in America and all the other countries. We do have to read old novels so that we can experience the writers writing from the
mm,
old times. And um, what you were saying, it also applied here.
yeah.
So we had a book that was called Mayas, and they were so like descriptional. So they were describing everything. So the house had this amount of doors, this amount of windows, they were green, they were yellow, well, everything. And whilst there was the other writer that was José Saramago, the one that we can find in Sitting on Chiado, and he would write like 10 lines of text without a bullet point.
Mm.
So everything was like all straightforward. And yeah, you would have to take a deep breath so that you could read it all through. And nowadays, it wouldn't make any sense to write something like that.
It's yeah, things have definitely changed. I find language fascinating in terms of how it evolves. And I mean, marketing seems so like I don't know, salesy, but there's so much uh, that it takes from culture and how language is changing every day and how we use it. So yes, I've definitely read some kind of older books have been like, wow, we do not talk like this anymore. And how interesting in terms of how it's really changed in terms of language.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts or questions about marketing and bootstrapping that might be on your mind before we uh
Um,
before we sign
yeah.
off, or anyone else on the call? Go for it, Inez. I feel like you had a thought there.
Um, no, yeah. It was really nice. And regarding the website is something that it cleared my head. Something that I've been wanting to learn how to do is to automate more
Okay.
so that it eases a little bit my time and how I manage everything. And um, as we went through the through this session, I I found it that it would still lay on the marketing side a little. And having everything, well, not everything automated, but part, we
Mm,
can still manage to have these automations to be still personal,
mm,
because what the automations like frightens me a little bit is if they get too cold or make a lot of distance, because when I start a conversation to someone, I like to I like for that person to feel like I am giving them my time, and I am indeed. And if I start to automate, I don't want the people to feel like, okay, it is just a message or just
mm.
something. And it has been hitting my thoughts a little bit, and I imagine not only me, but a lot of people too, when it comes to management on how to scale everything.
Yeah, and I think there's kind of this belief in culture that we need to like automate everything and optimize everything. It's kind of perpetuated for a while. And what I've seen with automation, especially when it comes to conversations, whether we're talking about like as smaller business owners that we might have, say, over email or over chat, or within companies that are using, chatbots in terms of having conversations, is it's about kind of layering in when is it relevant to save time
Yeah,
through an automation, and when is it relevant to have, a person to address, someone. And what you mentioned in terms of kind of talking with people, what the interesting thing is when we discuss our brand or product or services, is that maybe it's not automating conversations, but it might be kind of tools that we have in those conversations. So for example, if you're creating, say, guides about a certain topic, you can use LLMs to help you write and design that. And that would help you in aiding and having a better conversation. It doesn't necessarily have to be the conversation itself.
yeah,
Um, and it's also just seeing where it's relevant. I've used automation to like spark conversations, but then always jump in
yeah.
with a person.
That's it. Yeah,
And I think that kind of layering um, is still key. Of course, like really big companies that kind of have the resources can create something that feels more personal. I would say maybe for smaller companies, it's still that the person behind the company is still really important. And it's looking at for automation of within a conversation, what can we save time doing? And sometimes it's writing, sometimes it's reaching out, sometimes it's organizing our contacts better. So I think it's also finding what aspect helps you to engage with someone better and to make it easier. And it doesn't always have to be the conversation itself. It can be things around it. So I agree. It should still feel personal, because I think we're really aware these days of when something is not real. I remember once I received, and this was like a year and a half ago, so it's probably improved. It was like a video message about kind of an investment product, and I could tell it was. It's funny, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I could tell it was not real. That were kind of changing some of the speech depending on my name and things like that. And I was very bothered. I think I emailed back and I was like, please do not do that. Or please wait till the technology improves because it just felt so disingenuous. I would have rather you just gave me a generic message than trying to make it feel real when it wasn't. And they didn't do that again. And this was like a pretty large company. So I do think it's finding the right parts to make conversations better. And of course, over time, tools are going to improve. We'll improve how we use them and how we experiment with them.